I describe this as like taking aspirin for cancer. The CO2 that builds up in the atmosphere is like a malignancy that's still growing. And then to avoid the pain, you take some painkillers. But ultimately, the malignancy is going to kill you. And ultimately, the CO2 is going to kill us, or at least knock society back very, very seriously.
In this ClimateGenn episode, I'm speaking with Professor Raymond Pierrehumbert, who is the Halley Professor of Physics at the University of Oxford, about solar geoengineering. He and Professor Michael E. Mann from Pennsylvania State University co-authored an article in The Guardian on the 12th of March 2025 titled "The UK's Gamble on Solar Geoengineering is like using an aspirin for cancer." Here we delve deeper into Ray's overt objections to the UK's Advanced Research and Invention Agency, ARIA. They are the UK's version of the mysterious US Defence Advanced Projects Agency, DARPA. And ARIA has recently allocated 45 million British pounds to fund solar geoengineering projects, including outdoor experiments. In the next episode, I'm speaking with Mike Berners-Lee about his new book, Climate of Truth, which will be published next month.
But we've been lazy on truth, right? We've been really lazy on truth. There's been like a post-truth experiment, because the show-stopping thing that is stopping us getting anywhere with all of this stuff is deceit, right? So it turns out, if you look at the worst decisions on climate, the failure of the COPs, bogus debates in this country about whether to have new coal mines and things like that, they don't have poor judgment at their heart. They have flat-out deceit. And the same goes with many other, elements of the polycrisis. And if we can raise the standard on that, if we can dramatically raise the standard of honesty in our politics, media, and business, those are the three domains that I focus on, then that enables, for the first time, the possibility of the quality of decision-making that we actually need.
Thank you for listening and for supporting this series. Ray, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me today. We're largely responding to some of the points you covered in the article you've co-written with Professor Michael Mann in the US. I want to start with, you make the point is that the Advanced Research and Investment Agency, ARIA, in the UK, their project document titled Cooling the Earth highlights the need, but not the sort of outcome of sustained global scale deployment of solar radiation management. Can you attempt to paint a picture of what a world with sustained deployment of such engineering could or might look like, and what are the most worrying factors that sort of prompted your response?
Yeah. Well, actually, one of the most worrying factors is that it's very hard to say just what a world with extensive deployment of solar geoengineering would look like, because the effects cannot really be tested short of a full-scale deployment. And even then, you won't really know what you did to the Earth after it's been underway for many years, and there's been time for the Earth system to respond. But there are certain things we know for certainty. And the most scary thing about a world in which we have relied on solar geoengineering to keep the Earth habitable is what I call the Damocles world scenario. And on this, there's no scientific uncertainty. And it arises from the fact that carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere only very slowly over thousands of years. So the amount of carbon dioxide that we pump into the atmosphere continues to affect climate, essentially forever on a timescale relevant to humans. But all the solar geoengineering proposals, stratospheric aerosol injection and so forth, the particles that they create fall out of the atmosphere in a year or two. And we know that for sure from volcanic eruptions, from basic physics and so forth. So you're taking a climate influence that we have created and are still creating and mounting each year. We're taking a climate influence, carbon dioxide, which persists for millennia, and trying to cancel out with something that humanity has to do each and every year for thousands of years. If you ever are forced to stop by global depression, wars, climate wars over people who disagree about what kind of climate you've got, if you're ever forced to stop that geoengineering, you're hit with a massive rapid warming called termination shock, where you get all that pent-up warming that you've been canceling out coming back at you in a matter of under a decade for the most part. And over land, it warms much faster than over the ocean. So you get huge changes in the land-ocean heat contrast, which can drive all sorts of peculiar circulations. So that's that Damocles world aspect. That's what I consider the real showstopper, and the reason there isn't really any use case for solar geoengineering.
So, I mean, I've heard this before that there is an opportunity to detach carbon dioxide from its role as a regulator of temperature on the Earth. But what you're saying is that it's such a fraught proposition that it can't really be done.
Well, so there are two different things. Essentially, there are two parts of the Earth's energy budget. There's the energy that comes in from the sun, and there's the energy that goes out of the Earth in the form of infrared or heat radiation. So carbon dioxide affects the outgoing part of the energy budget. It affects the rate at which the Earth can lose energy by radiating heat radiation, whereas solar geoengineering affects a very different part of the climate system. It tries to reduce the amount of energy coming into the system. But so when you cancel out a big carbon dioxide effect with a big solar geoengineering effect, it doesn't create the same kind of climate as you would have with just low CO2. You've created these non-analog climates. But there's a second technology on the table that is often proposed as an exit strategy by solar geoengineering advocates, and that's the ability to scrub CO2 out of the atmosphere. So there are present something like 400 and some molecules per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and you can sift through the atmosphere in principle. Catch those rare molecules, those needle in a haystack, and then put them underground or someplace else. That's called direct air capture. And whereas I've said that because of the long lifetime of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we have to maintain solar geoengineering if we rely on it for millennia without fail. The geoengineering advocates often say, well, okay, we won't have to maintain it forever because we'll learn how to scrub CO2 out of the atmosphere. However, I say, show me that technology first. We're not, we are doing so little of that, and the economic incentives for scrubbing CO2 out of the atmosphere are so little that we're going to be hard pressed just to scrub enough CO2 out of the atmosphere to make up for the last 10% or so of recalcitrant emissions from CO2 from aircraft or so forth, let alone doing enough CDR to shorten the recovery time of the climate. And allowing us to terminate solar geoengineering in an orderly way. It's just a fantasy. So I'm not sure which of these two aspects you were trying to focus on, but but it is important to talk about the fallacy of assuming that direct air capture is going to allow us to get out of the millennial commitment to having to maintain solar geoengineering if we rely on it.
I was really focusing on stratospheric injection. One of the arguments, and I've had this from scientists in the US who are against solar geoengineering, is that there is a case for research because you cite the slippery slope whereby small scale becomes large scale and then we're sort of deploying. But what if small scale teaches us that big scale just won't work?
Oh, so the real hazard with outdoor experimentation, with even small scale outdoor experimentation, is that it actually can't tell us. It actually can't tell us things like, will it work? Will the technique work? Because what happens when you inject a little puff of something into the stratosphere that's relatively pristine is so different from what happens if you've been doing this at a scale of many Pinatubos per year, many volcanoes per year going off, and the stratosphere is saturated, the particles start to clump together, you've changed the global stratospheric chemistry, you have done things like changed El Nino and ocean circulation simulations because those things take years to respond and they're global phenomena. None of these small scale puff experiments have the capability of addressing the serious issues of what would happen in a full scale deployment. So it's not as if those outdoor experimentations are going to tell us about what might go wrong. But the risk there is that almost any outdoor experimentation you would contemplate does address engineering issues. Things like how you actually create those fine particles, how rapidly the plume from an aircraft disperses, what kind of nozzle you use, things like that. And also, you can't assume that all the people doing the experiments will have the best of wills and be the most honest, because the outdoor experimentation can be a blind for developing engineering technologies. And the last thing you want to do is to develop an engineering technology for something that somebody else might deploy, whether or not it's wise, justified, or safe. So that's the essential problem. So, insofar as there may be a role for research, I think that more computer simulations with more sophisticated models, there's something to be said for that. And indeed, most of the work that's indicated some of the potential global problems with solar geoengineering has come out of simulation work. There has been work, for example, showing that if you try to bunch up your solar geoengineering in the Arctic to freeze the Arctic, you completely mess up tropical circulation patterns. And there's a limit to what extent we can rely on models, because a lot of the aspects of physics that solar geoengineering affects are things like clouds that we don't do well in models, things like regional precipitation distribution that models are not very certain about, soil moisture, things like that, extreme events, heat waves, and so forth. So the models can give us an indication of what might go wrong, but we can't really use the models as an indication of what might go right. Because it's when things go wrong that you have the big adverse effects. But so that's the sort of just in case scenario, that we need to do these outdoor experiments to learn what might go wrong or to learn how to do it just in case. That's just opens the door for some rogue actor to deploy this technology, whether the rest of us want it or not.
That's a nice segue into my next question. A few weeks ago, Jeffrey Sachs, the economist, said in a webinar with reference to SRM deployment, the fundamental problem is that the world is not governed by even the most basic ethical standards of survival, decency, and respect for young people and future generations. And he was referring to the current state of affairs in the US and beyond. With this sort of techno hubris that we're seeing at the moment that's off the scale, isn't a Doge-like break everything approach to climate engineering by these guys the same guys who have rockets? Does it make it sort of inevitable that we're going in that direction, do you think?
Well, I don't think it's inevitable. I think actually the public awareness that this kind of research is going on at all is still pretty weak, and so I'm very grateful to journalists who are helping to spread the word, because I think first of all, more light needs to be shed on what's going on. So I wouldn't consider it inevitable. I mean, for example, when Harvard tried to do a field experiment on geoengineering in what Westerners call Lapland, what the indigenous people in Sweden called Sapmi, there was a public outcry, protests and online activity and so forth that especially engaged world indigenous peoples, not just the Sami of northern Sweden, Finland, etc., but also indigenous peoples worldwide, from Africa to Native Americans, and that outcry actually did force Harvard Harvard to back down on that. And I don't know whether they'll try to pop up that experiment someplace else. But I think it's not just some kind of, Ludditism. People actually recognize what a dangerous thing this is to do to the global climate and how it affects people who fundamentally have no say in what's going on. But certainly the possibility that a billionaire somewhere or some country that just doesn't care what it's doing to the rest of the world might actually take whatever technology is developed and deploy it. And so you can address questions about how you can stop that. And I would say the biggest problem right now is that there is no world governance or even national governance, except maybe for a little bit in Mexico, and a few states, for rather peculiar reasons, have actually started to address. States in the U.S. have started to address geoengineering experiments. But the danger of doing research that can develop technology and releasing this technology into a world where there's essentially no governance is huge. And so I'd say even if we were going to contemplate outdoor experimentation, and I don't think there's any real case for outdoor experimentation, but if we were going to contemplate that, the governance should come first. There's no treaty that forbids this. There's no national law in the U.S., even in democratic administrations. There was no national law in the U.S. that really controlled it. There's no national law in the U.K. that controls this. So if someone decides to just up and do it, there's very little leverage to actually bring some external controls. And so the ARIA program is governed only by the governance that ARIA itself has imposed on its researchers. It's not really under the purview of any of DEFRA or any UK agency.
In previous interviews where I've spoken to lawyers and such, like, they've suggested that anything like this would be governed most likely under the UN Security Council, which set up to govern disputes and such like. But at the same time, that's largely defunct in the current global political system. So if treaties are unreachable because states seem to have all gone rogue or very self-interested or are acting unilaterally in most cases, does this become more likely by the rogue state actor that you're highlighting?
Well, so this piles on the arguments for just not doing research that develops the technology. And so if there were orderly world governance, if there were treaties, if there were any indication that we could make treaties and stick to them, that I would feel very different about solar geoengineering research. But most of the proponents who have given various rosy use case scenarios about solar geoengineering, we'll just do a little bit of it and not enough to incur a big termination shock risk. Those rely on a fantasy world. It would be an insult to science fiction to say that it's a science fiction world, to think that the world is in a position where some group of nations can agree we're just going to do a little bit of it and no more, especially when you introduce this technology at a time when we haven't even started our path of CO2 emissions downward towards net zero. And that's the most dangerous scenario, because if you start to introduce geoengineering technology at a time when we're still pumping more CO2 into the atmosphere, since that CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere, each year you have to do more solar geoengineering and more and more and more. And if you eliminate some of the more obvious symptoms of global warming, it completely undercuts the visibility of the need to actually achieve net zero. It's why in the article I described this as like taking aspirin for cancer. The CO2 that builds up in the atmosphere is like a malignancy that's still growing. And then to avoid the pain, you take some painkillers, but ultimately the malignancy is going to kill you. And ultimately the CO2 is going to, kill us, or at least knock society back very, very seriously. And so it's the whole geopolitical context and environmental context into which we're proposing people are proposing to develop this technology and release it into the wild. There's a question, how much can you delay the development of that technology? But what you can certainly say is that pumping money like ARIA is doing into outdoor experimentation accelerates that day when we're going to have to face this difficulty. So we shouldn't be actively creating harm. And the first line of defense is to actually not at least have governments and philanthropy funding these outdoor experimentations.
Over the last few years, this has become a topic that's been much more prevalent at COPs, inside events, as opposed to in the main negotiations. You just mentioned cumulative emissions. If you even take from the signing of the Paris Agreement, 10 years of continued emissions mean the problem is much bigger now than it was then.
Yeah.
And a lot of people I've spoken to from Africa, West Africa, from Central America, from Southeast Asia, and they're pro-research into geoengineering, and they're pretty much saying, well, we're doomed anyway because no one's doing anything, and the problems are getting worse, and our bounce back from extreme weather events is setting our development of our nations back so far that if you take this off the table, isn't it just another blow to those countries? How would you respond to these kinds of arguments coming from news sources?
Yeah, well, so I would primarily respond by saying that solar geoengineering would not actually make the situation better for these developing countries, for Africa. It would make the situation worse because given this problem of millennial commitment, it's almost inevitable that sooner or later there's going to be a termination shock. And so if a gradual warming is bad for, say, Africa, how bad is a sudden warming that plays out over 10 years when there's not been time to try to adapt, to put air conditioning in place, to adapt to crops and things like that. So it doesn't really solve the problem. It actually it sets you up for a somewhat deferred but much bigger catastrophe. And so if you think, say, heat death in Calcutta is bad in a gradually warming world, just imagine if you're ticking along and you've managed to keep heat waves down by solar geoengineering, and then something happens, a war, whatever, and suddenly it stops, and then suddenly you're talking about a megadeath situation where an unprepared region is faced with annual summer fatal heat waves. So in that regard, it just kicks the can down the road and sets you up for a bigger disaster later. Whereas an emphasis on a adaptation to, insofar as possible, to a more gradually warming climate would set up the developing world better. But the other thing is that we still have time to get to net zero. And so, giving up on that right now is premature. Susan Solomon, National Medal of Science winner, central to the discovery of the ozone hole mechanism. She has a wonderful book called Solvable, pointing out that, not only are the technologies to reach net zero available, they're economically beneficial. And there are even a lot of economic incentives in the system, independent of politics, to deploy them. And we are just beginning to turn the curve on those things. And so just when we're starting to grasp that problem of getting to net zero, to inject this excuse, solar geoengineering, to abandon that progress is the worst possible thing. But the other thing I would say to third world, to developing world people who are worried that the rich world is not going to do anything about CO2. The other thing I would say to them is that solar geoengineering definitely will have winners and losers. Once it's deployed, we'll discover things that go wrong. And when has the rich world ever taken the needs of the developing world into account when it decides what's good for it. And so if you have a choice between, say, fixing the climate for rich bankers in New York or London and fixing the climate for poor farmers in Somalia, I have a pretty good guess about who's going to be deciding what climate you get. And this has been held out. It's been an effective diplomatic effort on the part of the solar geoengineering advocates to try to train the developing world as portraying this as a way of rectifying social justice and climate justice imbalances, and this is a way we can fix your climate for you. But it's just another bait. It's just another bait and switch. It's another. Solar geoengineering is just another stick for the rich world to clobber the poor world with. So I think the developing world should not take much comfort from the assurances that they've been given that this will be good for them.
You talked about the net zero and the solvable side of this. We've also talked about the geopolitical crisis that we're in at the moment, which makes net zero almost toxic itself. Is this an aberration, or are we sort of being blown right off course from doing the right thing on climate at the moment?
Well, people always ask me, do I despair about solving the climate crisis? And I always say despair is not an option. And again, the fact that there actually are economic benefits which you can use as a way of persuading people if you actually get the right platform to do that. The fact that there are big economic benefits and national security benefits in relying less on fossil fuels, or in fact zeroing out your dependence on fossil fuels, that's a powerful incentive to turn things around. And when I look at the growth of renewables and electric cars in China, which is actually not the biggest historical emitter, but the biggest current emitter. In some ways, what happens in China is even more important than what happens in the U.S. And because not only does China account for a lot of current emissions, but they develop the technology and sell it to allow the rest of the world to get to net zero more cheaply. So I think there are a lot of reasons not to just throw in the towel on achieving net zero. It'll be a constant struggle, but I would say, the struggle should be focusing on getting the world back on a pathway to net zero. It shouldn't be focused on this mirage that we have a backup technology to solve our problem. The solar geoengineering put as a sort of a break glass in case of emergency thing, which it just isn't, because it doesn't address the root cause. It's especially pointless in a context where you're still pumping more CO2 into the atmosphere. I had this other article. There's no plan B for the climate crisis, and often there's a plan B framing for solar geoengineering, which says that this is why we have to do the research and develop the technology. But it's not in any sense a plan B, a way to buy time, or any of those usual rationales. And so there really isn't any alternative to doing our very best to get to net zero as fast as possible. Now, if we do get to net zero, let's say the scenario, we get to net zero, but the world is 2.5 degrees warmer, and we'd like it to be 2 degrees warmer. Once we've already gotten close to net zero, and if the world is looking fairly, politically stable, then I'd say maybe then we start thinking about, a few years in advance of reaching net zero, we start thinking about whether we can trim 0.5 degree or so off the climate and off the warming, and then bring us back down into a more comfortable level. And if you can actually govern it to the extent of limiting the maximum extent, once you've already gotten down to near zero or on a clear pathway to be close to it, that's a very different situation than what we're in right now. Okay. And so the timing for doing geoengineering research, especially outdoor experimentation, is just all wrong. It's introducing this false hope at a time when we really need to be doubling down on getting to net zero.
You say at the end of your article that this can be stopped with rigorous pushback, and it's very much a call to action statement. Tell us more about what this rigorous pushback actually looks like, and we can sort of home in on ARIA, for example.
There are multiple levels of this. The first thing I need to do is to get through to the Labour government, especially the Rachel Reeves, that this may not be the biggest part of the budget, but this is not something they should be funding because it's harmful. And there's just zero awareness, as far as I can tell, anywhere in the current government of what ARIA is actually doing in this space. And so who knows whether it's possible with everything else on the government's agenda to actually rein in ARIA's funding for this area, but certainly ARIA is supposed to be around and renewed for a long time, and reining in expansion of ARIA's activity in this area should be on the government's radar screen. So, but that's my first sort of agenda here, because the ARIA program is especially dangerous in terms of legitimizing this kind of research, outdoor experimentation on solar geoengineering, because it's essentially the first government-funded program. It's the first program with government imprimatur that has planned to fund outdoor experimentation, which could develop technology. And actually, as far as the name of ARIA, it's actually the Advanced Research and Invention Agency. And so if you put the emphasis on invention, they're not really about fundamental science. They're about inventing technologies. So they're really about inventing solar geoengineering technology, not about addressing fundamental scientific questions, if you take the name of their agency seriously. So actually getting the government to restrain, put more oversight on ARIA is in some sense the first order of business. But I'm also thinking about public protest. With regard to the ARIA program, in particular, their protocol for organizing outdoor experimentation does involve self-imposed governments in terms of consulting stakeholders. How seriously they take that will remain to be seen. But if people come out and flood those meetings in those places where the experiments are going to take place, that's another line of defense. That was effective with regard to Harvard's attempted experiment. This does bring us to the unfortunate situation in the UK that peaceful public protests have wound up with getting people in jail. We're in the unfortunate situation that police powers legislation passed under the Tories and maintained under the Labour government has actually served to stifle public protests, and they've come down much harder on environmental protests and climate-related protests than they have on, say, the farmers' protests and things like that. In that context, that's a difficult issue. But I am definitely thinking in terms of this call to action beyond trying to get the attention of the government into what they're actually funding. The next line of defense is actually public protest.
In terms of protest, I mean, one of the people that you're referring to who's in prison for peaceful protests, or wasn't even protesting, is Roger Hallam, who's behind Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil and things associated with them. When I interviewed him prior to him being locked away, he was very much for geoengineering research and saw that as a major component in the future. So this is kind of my last question is, we're in an era where people are really experiencing and they're really concerned about climate risk. And we're obviously going to be divided over what actions to take to mitigate, to adapt, and in this case, intervene. How do you see us bridging these differences and making the right decisions on the sort of ongoing existential issues we're facing?
I think actually the first task is to develop a better understanding about just how different a world and how dangerous a world we would be living in if we started to rely on solar geoengineering. And I am aware that some parts of the environmental movement, including in the U.S., the Environmental Defense Fund, right? It's now called Environmental Defense, has actually started funding geoengineering research, not outdoor research so far, but they've been interested in it. And part of this is a panic reaction. It's a justified panic reaction it's the wrong direction to take the panic. But it's a panic reaction. We know global warming is bad. We've known for a long time it's bad. The impacts are looking on the ground even worse than we thought they would be. And so there is this panic in the environmental community among sort of honest, concerned people about climate. But in this panic, they're turning to what has been sold as a quick fix, a backup technology. But the reality of what the world would be like if you rely on this has not really sunk through into that community. And that's part of my mission. And I find I repeat myself over and over about just the risks of termination shock, the non-analog climates, and things like that. And as a scientist, it goes against the grain to repeat stuff I've already published, but I find that the social memory is very short. So I have to keep saying these things over and over again. And I think this issue of termination shock in Damocles' world is one that people haven't really internalized as a big risk. So you imagine you're sitting there, and I call it Damocles' world because this shield that's reflecting sunlight is like the sword of Damocles hanging over you. But maybe a more sort of accessible picture is that it's like living under the threat of global thermonuclear war. So when I was a boy, we had these duck and cover exercises, which we might be having again, unfortunately. And it felt like Russia was going to launch a global thermonuclear war almost at any point. So there's constant fear in the background that pervaded almost everything about this catastrophe that could happen at any time. But in some ways, a solar geoengineering world would be even more threatening because the whole time you have this thin stratospheric layer, which has to be maintained without fail, which is all that there is between you and an absolute climate disaster. And if that shield failed, it affects every square inch of the planet. There's no escape. And it's sudden, and the capacity for global deaths from sudden heat waves, they're comparable to what you would have in some estimates. They could be even more than what you would have in a quite large-scale thermonuclear war. And so the terror under which people would be living on a day-to-day basis, saved from climate disruption by this thin, fragile shield, relying on a lot of agreement among world leaders about what climate you want, that's a terrifying world. And then people haven't yet internalized just how terrifying that world would be to live in.
But do you think we have seemed to internalize the inevitability of a technological world and the severe risk that is going to be run by psychopaths? It's kind of the media presents it that way at the moment.
Yeah.
And in a way that there's a sort of bridge to this, and we're not providing an alternative view of the world that is tangible, believable, viable for people to internalize. And that's perhaps another reason why these things develop a sort of momentum in a way is that.
And I think there's a vision of the future that's needed here. It should be an optimistic vision of the future because humans have faced technological challenges and solved them before. And the idea that we're ingenious, we unleash the power of technological innovation, and that somehow we can't use that technological innovation to get to net zero carbon dioxide emissions. The idea that we're so technologically capable, but this is the one completely unsolvable problem, that's nonsense. Whereas there's so many ways in which people have more freedom and a better standard of living under a world in which we do these things to decarbonize. For example, if you have a good train system run on electricity, like France has, instead of having to sit in a traffic jam in your automobile, you can go on your holidays to see your relatives in a comfortable train ride. And if you have walkable cities, and it's not a matter of confining people, involuntarily to some little bit, but if you have walkable neighborhoods and so forth, you spend more time with your family and less time on long commutes and less time stuck in traffic jams. If you have renewable energy and the pricing scheme is decoupled from natural gas, then we wouldn't have these awful price shocks that are driving poor people in the UK into complete fuel poverty. We wouldn't be subject to blackmail by Russia on cutoffs of natural gas and things like that. We wouldn't be subject so much to sabotage of pipelines. There's also of course, undersea cables you have to worry about. But there's so many ways in which there's a positive vision of the world. Cleaner air, just more time with family, more freedoms in a decarbonized world. And we need to be playing up and making real to people that vision of the benefits, the greater freedoms that you have in a world like that. And so I've often said, of course, with scientists, we are most comfortable talking about how bad it gets if you let CO2 continue to accumulate in the atmosphere. But I really think the problem isn't that people are insufficiently scared about the consequences of global warming. The problem is that people are too scared of the solutions, whereas the solutions are largely beneficial. And so I think we just really have to talk about, how good the world would be with those solutions, just like Susan Solomon does in her book.
Well, there's a sort of segue into multiple different conversations there, but it's a really good place to finish. So thank you very much for taking the time. It's been great.
Okay, thanks.
If you are concerned about the future, then why not travel with me through every COP conference from COP21 in Paris to COP28 in Dubai by ordering my book, COP Out, How Governments Have Failed the People on Climate. In COP Out, you'll gain insights into what is actually going on in these supposed world-saving conferences and how we have ended up in this dire era of dangerous consequences. You can order COP Out via the link in the notes or on any online bookstore worldwide, in paperback or audio version.